left front brakes, right front brakes. I think we got a little bit of a problem. Welcome back to Dark Horse Auto and Diesel, the notorious 2002 to 2005 Ford Explorer. Today we're going to be changing out the front brake calipers on this. The right front is obviously seized up, as you saw from the beginning of the video. And the steps that we're going to do today are going to be the same regardless of whether it's two-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, V6, V8, Explorer, Mountaineer. Aviators, I think, are a little different, so I'm not going to go into too much certainty on the specifics of that. But Explorers and Mountaineers from 2002 to 2005, all variants, this is going to be the same procedure. So the first thing we need to do is to get it up, and if you have access to a lift, Ford was nice enough to put these little markers here on where you want to lift it from. You know, a little diamond shape there. Come to the back, and there's your other one. That's your lift points. But if you are cheap and or broke like myself, you're gonna have to just jack it. And this piece down here, this cross member, is a really good jacking point. So go ahead and lift it up from there. And then I usually come over here and put my jack stands. Of course, I didn't go high enough. Anyway, I put the jack stands right underneath these. All right, now we can get our nuts off. Be a 19 millimeter or 3/4, doesn't matter. Pretty much everything's metric on this, so might as well just use one set of tools. Now, if you don't have an impact, you should have done this already. Loosen them up when it was on the ground. Ooh, I can still feel the heat coming off of that. Yep, that's still warm. Little trick I like to do at this point now is to take a couple of our lug nuts and just stick it on here and run them up just kind of snug. And what this will do is this will help keep the rotor in place while we're taking this apart. It keeps everything from just flopping around. And now we can go ahead and loosen up our caliper bolts. Which, looking at this thing, it's no surprise that it's seized up. Stuff just flaking off of it. So anyway, there's a bolt here and one right there. Those are 14 millimeter. Go ahead and take them off. Leave that in loosely. Next we'll get a pry bar and just gently try to work it in here to loosen this up, which this one being seized is definitely pretty tight in there. Okay, once you've got this loosened up, go ahead and get a short tarp strap or a coat hanger or something to hang this from, because you don't want to leave it hang from your brake hose. Okay, now before we go ahead and take the caliper completely off, since we're going to be messing with the brake line here, I like to just break this loose just a little bit. Obviously we don't want brake fluid running all over the floor yet, but makes it a lot easier to break this loose now rather than trying to do it when the caliper's just hanging here. And that's, on this one anyway, is going to be a 9/16, which will probably be the only standard size socket you use on this job. Okay. Alright, just snug that back up just a little bit. Now go ahead and get a coat hanger or some string, tarp strap, wire, I don't care what, but something to hang your caliper from. This little tarp strap is what I always use. It's convenient length. Go ahead and take this bolt the rest of the way out. And then just hang it up, because you do not want your brake caliper hanging by the brake hose. That's a good way to screw things up and make it so you have to replace the hose. Next we'll come up here and just open this up so that it can allow fluid to come back into it. You don't need to take the cap completely off, just have it loose. Now we'll go ahead and just take the wheel speed sensor, just unclip this from the brake hose so that it's not in our way. Since these pads are junk, we're going to use this on the next step. Wow, I don't know why those are on so tight. Wow. Well, that's a first for me. Never seen that happen. Alright, now we can take our handy brake caliper compressor here, push this back up in there. The reason we're doing this is so we have less fluid running out. Less fluid that we have to put back in, I should say. Oh yeah, this is definitely a problem as well. Ooh. Yep, she's tight. Wow. Now, a good working caliper, this will actually compress pretty easily. You could almost do it by hand. Now, see that piston there, that one's going in pretty easy. But this one over here is definitely not. So a little pointer I'd like to give you at this time is if you do have a sticking brake problem, it could also be the brake hose. Sometimes they break down on the inside and they'll actually act like a check valve. But if that's the case, you'll know when you're doing this part, because when you compress one side, the other side will want to push back out. And right here, I've got this thing about as tight as I can get it by hand, and you can still see there's a gap between these two pieces here where if the brake hose was actually the problem, when I push in on this side will want to come back out if the hose is not allowing fluid to run back up. I decided to jump over here to this side real quick just to show you guys how this should go. I already got the one side kind of compressed, well, all the way. I mean, you see how easy that's going? This is the way it should go. Going in nice and smooth. The other side wasn't pushing out. So this side is still good to go-ish. You should always replace them in pairs, but we'll get to that. So when you're ordering your parts, a lot of places they'll have the option of the caliper with a bracket or without. One good way to find out if you actually need the bracket is to go ahead and check your slide pins here. If they move freely, you don't necessarily need to replace the bracket unless it's damaged in some way. But like this one here, it's a little crusty, but structurally I'm comfortable running it. So it's up to you how you want to do it. But if they're seized up, obviously, yeah, get a new bracket. I think it's like 10 more bucks. You just have to make the call. Is it worth 10 extra bucks to go ahead and replace this bracket or not? All right, next I'm going to take off the caliper mounting bracket here. As I mentioned previously, this is optional, but in this case, the customer ended up buying calipers that has a new bracket, and it's 18 millimeter. There's one bolt right here, and then another one, that one right there. And these are usually on pretty tight, so I'm going to use my close quarters impact wrench here. Now you'll want to save this because typically when you buy the bracketed calipers, they want you to return the bracket along with the caliper in order to get your core charge back. So now at this point, if we were doing the rotor as well, we just take these off and the rotor should just pop right off. May need a little persuasion with a block of wood and a hammer or something, depending on if you're reusing it or not. If you're not reusing it, go ahead and just beat the heck out of it with whatever you want. But if you're reusing it, you'll want to use like a dead blow hammer, something like that, and just kind of gently tap around it, rotate it, tap it off. We're not doing that today, so we're going to go ahead and get our new bracket put on and start working on the caliper itself. So next, if you have the bracketed caliper, you're going to want to take this apart. I've already got mine loosened up here. For whatever reason, when they ship these, they like to put these bolts on so freaking tight that you about need an impact to get them off. Really annoys me, but it is what it is. And at this point, you'll also want to make double sure that you have the correct side going on. And since we're working on the right side of the truck right now, we want to make sure we have the right caliper And you can tell that because your line will attach on the inside, your pistons will be to the inside of the truck, and your bleeder screw will be at the top. Always make sure that bleeder screw is at the top. Personally, I've never made this mistake. Now that I said that, I'm sure my time is coming, but I've seen a lot of people make this mistake that they'll end up putting the bleeder screw down at the bottom, and air floats on liquid, so clearly you're never going to get the air out of the system. I've had people call me, oh, I did my brakes and I can't get them to bleed out. I bled them and my pedal still goes to the floor. Well, that's because they had their caliper, obviously this would be on the other side, but the bleeder screw at the bottom. So all of this here is just full of air. Well, obviously that's not going to work too well for braking. And at this point, what I like to do too is go ahead and pull your slide pins out. They come pre-greased, but I like to see a little bit more grease in these than what they put in them. And I always keep some stuff like this on hand. And just slap a little bit more grease on there, all the way around it. You're not really going to put too much in. If you do put too much, it'll just be difficult to get back down in the hole, and it'll just squish the grease out on you. Alright, next we're going to put some of the caliper grease in here where our brake pads slide on. A lot of people forget about that step, and like this case here you saw where I pretty much had to destroy the brake pads to get them off. That was largely because nobody put lubrication on here, and they get rusty and seized up. So you don't need a whole lot here, just enough to keep corrosion away and, you know, allow it to slide easily. You don't want it dripping off of here because you don't want to get the stuff on your rotor. I don't think I need to explain why that would be bad. Alright, now we can come back over here to the truck and get this installed. And this part here is where having these lug nuts on here will help, because a lot of times now your rotor will just be kind of flopping here, and you can actually end up getting grease on your rotor from it hanging loose. So that just helps keep everything in place. Sometimes you still accidentally get a little bit of grease on the rotor, but as long as you clean it off, you're fine. Now, from what I've seen with these two bolts here, I guess I call it an anchor plate. The torque spec varies from year to year. I'm not going to go over the torque specs on this video here. They range from 83 to 155 foot-pounds and all places in between. Some places say 83, some places say 100, 112, like I said, 155. When it comes to torquing those down, make sure you look up the proper spec for your year of truck. Myself, to figure out what the proper torque spec is, run it up until the bolt head just touches to where you just start to notice some extra tension on your ratchet, and then give it about 1/8 of a turn or so after that, and that's usually pretty close to where you want it to be. Obviously you don't want these coming out, but at the same time you don't want to strip it out either. Next, if you ended up getting any of the caliper grease on your rotor, go ahead and just get a rag with some brake cleaner on it and wipe that off. Next, we'll get our brake pads ready to go. So what we'll do here is just take some more of our brake caliper grease and just put it in these areas here where it slides on the bracket. Alright, now we can get our pads put into the bracket here, and make sure you pay attention to this part here. This one, I'm ashamed to say that I've actually screwed this up before on more than one occasion. Make sure your friction side is towards the rotor. I have actually put one on backwards before. Make sure it's facing the right direction, which makes sure you have these in here, by the way. If you don't put these in, your brake pads are going to be sloppy, and it's just not as good. It's not good. There we go. Usually if you kind of angle it in and then pop it back, it works. And then the same for the back one here. Okay, this next step here isn't 100% necessary, but I like to do it anyway. It tends to help with disassembly a little bit and can also help reduce brake noise. I usually take a little bit of the brake caliper grease and put it on the piston faces here. Not a whole lot, just enough. Nice light little coating. And also on this side here, alright, now make sure we got our bolts handy, and we're going to go ahead and install the caliper. Like I said, make sure you have the correct side. And as you snug these down, make sure that this is positioned right to where it'll actually stop up against it. You don't want it facing like up and down, because it'll obviously won't be completely tight, and just very loose for the time being. So now we'll torque our actual caliper mounting bolts down, and this one seems to be the same no matter where I looked, at 24 foot-pounds. And considering this is a Harbor Freight torque wrench, it's probably not the most accurate, but it'll be close enough. And these are pretty easy to strip out, so I would highly recommend torquing these ones down to the proper spec. Now for the messy part. This is where I feel like it's important to tell you guys that brake fluid is corrosive. It will take paint off of your vehicle. It's probably going to take the paint off of this pretty new caliper. And if you have this crappy Rust-Oleum epoxy on your floor like I do, that was a complete waste of my time and money, it will make that peel up as well. I've learned that from experience. So we'll go ahead and get our banjo bolt removed here, and I like to keep everything pretty much as ready to go as possible to minimize the amount of brake fluid dripping out, which that reminds me, we need to come up to under the hood. At this point now, we want to close this. Make sure that's tight. I don't know how much it'll actually help, but with that being sealed up, it'll actually kind of help create a little bit of a vacuum up here to hopefully minimize the amount of fluid that runs out of the end of the brake hose while we're messing with it down there. The new one is 14 millimeter. And if you were smart, earlier you already loosened this up. So go ahead and get that taken off. So the corrosiveness of brake fluid is why I have this nice KitchenAid pan down here to keep it off my floor. Alright, now you're going to want to work pretty quickly. And no, don't ever pinch your brake hose off to try to keep the fluid from coming out, because you have a very high likelihood of completely ruining it, collapsing it on the inside. If I have to explain why that's bad, you shouldn't be doing this. Alright, make sure that's cleaned off as good as we can quickly do. Alright, grab our banjo bolt and one copper washer, our other new copper washer, and start threading quickly before you lose all your brake fluid. Alright, and then snug this up. Definitely don't overdo that. I believe the recommended torque spec for that is 26 foot-pounds. I feel like that's a little bit excessive, considering that that's more than the actual bracket bolts. But I would say somewhere around 15 to 20 would probably be more than sufficient. You just need to make sure that your copper washer is crushed enough in there to actually seal it without also stripping the threads out. Now we will clean up some of the brake fluid here before it completely corrodes all of the paint off of here. Obviously try not to get your brake cleaner up in there and rinsing all of your brake grease off. We're just trying to clean the outside of the caliper off here to keep it from peeling the paint off. And if you're doing this outside, one interesting little fact is that due to the properties of brake fluid, you can actually pretty effectively just use water to clean it off. Brake fluid absorbs water very readily, which is why it's actually recommended to flush your brake fluid out every couple of years. Next, we're going to bleed the caliper out, and there's several different ways to do that. You can use a vacuum bleeder, or what I'm just going to do here is just gravity bleed it, because pretty much anybody can do that by themselves in their driveway. These bleeder screws are always really fun to try to find the right tool for. They almost never seem to be the same size, So with this one here, the closest thing I could find was 9mm. So we'll go ahead and loosen that up. Okay, we're not actually using a pistol for that. Wonder how many liberal tears just were shed from that little clip. Probably none, because they're too busy driving around in their Priuses that they don't actually work on. None of them are manly enough to actually come out here and work on their own stuff. So anyway, grab our 9mm wrench. In my case anyway. Yours will probably be a different size. I don't know what size this is actually supposed to be, but 9mm kind of fits. So, alright, since we're gravity bleeding, all we do is just open this up and wait. And actually at this point, if you want to speed the process up, we can go up and take the cap off of the master cylinder. I'm going to do that real quick. And while we're waiting for that to drip out, I like to kind of tap on this a little bit. Make sure any air bubbles that are stuck to the inside work their way out. And then once we see fluid running out of there, we can go ahead and close it. This usually takes several minutes, but like I said, you can do this by yourself in your driveway with no special tools. It just requires a little bit of patience, which I don't have much of. And there we go. Make sure you round that off. Go ahead and get our brake cleaner out here again and clean this up before it strips the paint. And we'll snug that up with our 3/8 and make sure it rounds it off. Just very somewhat snug. Don't over tighten that, because if you ever need to get back in here and rebleed these in a couple years or so, especially if you live in the salt belt, you're going to be kicking yourself for over tightening that, because it won't come out. Then we can take the little bleeder condom and stick that back on. Now we can come back in here and get our ABS sensor, clip back onto the brake hose. And we'll also make sure that we get our strap or wire, whatever we had hanging the old caliper up. Now we can take these off. And just double check everything real quick. Make sure you didn't forget any tools down here. Everything's tightened up. Just go over everything in your head. And now we can put our wheel and tire back on. And with our impact on the lowest setting, go ahead and snug these up. Those are not tight. Don't be one of those idiots that just drives your lug nuts home as hard as the impact will do it. I see people do that, including professionals, and it drives me nuts. That's how you strip your studs out, break them off, strip your nuts out, whatever. And if you're using torque sticks, go lower than what the factory recommends for the torque spec on the lug nuts. These are 100 foot-pounds. I would recommend using a 90 or 95-pound torque stick. Always do your final torque with a torque wrench. These are some of the most important fasteners on your vehicle. You don't want bad things happening to these. Don't be stupid. So now if you're doing both sides like I did, you can go ahead and move on to the other side. If you are doing both sides and you're not overly experienced, I would recommend doing one side at a time. That way, if you take something apart and you forget how it went back together, you always have the other side that's still together as a reference. So I'm already done with the other side. So now we can go ahead and get the vehicle off the jacks and torque our lug nuts down. And then torque them down in a cross pattern to, like I said, 100 foot-pounds. And then I like to go back through and check them all again. And since they all moved a little bit, check them again. I like to do this until they stop moving. And then we'll cover our nuts up so we don't get arrested for indecent exposure. And make sure, actually most of the time I don't put those back on yet. You want to make sure that in about 50 to 100 miles, you retorque those lug nuts. Yes, I've experienced what happens if you don't do that. Interestingly, it was another third-gen Explorer. I nearly lost a wheel going down the highway. Thankfully, I noticed the vibration in the truck before it came completely off, but all 5 lug nuts were just finger loose. Always recheck your lug nuts. And when you recheck them, if they move in another 50 to 100 miles, check them again. Now, before we forget, we'll make sure our master cylinder cap is screwed back on. So now that you're pretty well done, there is still one more very important step you need to do before you just go starting it up and throwing it in gear and taking off. This is another one of those things that, yep, I've learned the hard way. Thankfully, I did not go through my garage door. As of right now, you will have no brake pressure. what you need to do next is go ahead and start the truck up. Now you're going to want to pump the brake pedal to build up some brake pressure, because if you just go throwing it in gear right now, you're going to go either through your toolbox or through your garage door, whichever direction you happen to be going. Now, an important thing to note here, don't push the pedal all the way to the floor. Vehicles of this age, the master cylinder ends up getting kind of worn in the normal travel path, and if you push it all the way to the floor, you may actually tear the seals inside of there, and you'll be replacing a master cylinder within the next few days possibly. That's another one of those things. Yep, I've learned it the hard way. So just pump the brakes a little bit, maybe halfway down the travel. Just don't go too far with it. And then you'll start to feel a little bit of pressure build up. There we go. Now we've got pressure. And make sure. Yep, she holds. So that's it. You're done. Now you know how to do pretty much a full brake job on one of these lovely hunks of junk. As a quick little afterthought here, you may notice after doing this that your brake pedal still feels kind of spongy, or you got to send it halfway to the floor before it starts engaging, because since we put new pads on, you should actually start building brake pressure further up in the pedal travel. And if you're finding that's not the case, you may have to do what I'm about to do here and rebleed the brakes. Not really a big deal. If you're feeling particularly lazy like I am right now, and also you're just trying to get it done quickly, just turn the wheel to one side and you can see the bleeder screw in there, and you can just hook a little hose to it or something to catch the fluid so it doesn't run all over your wheel. That's not a good idea to do. And make sure you're checking your brake fluid level as well. Yes, there's a sensor and there's a light on the dash, but are you sure that light works? Are you sure the sensor works? And don't fill it all the way up to the max, especially if you don't have new pads in the rear as well, because otherwise when you redo those eventually, you're going to end up being over full on brake fluid. So this is a little bit low. I mean, the max is up here and we're actually down to about here. So I'm going to fill it up to probably about here or so.